Don't expect money. We didn't want you then, and we don't want you now. My biological mother's words hit me like ice water as I stood in the marble foyer of their mansion. For 50 years, I'd imagined this moment, and with one calculated sentence, Margaret Ashworth shattered every dream. But what she didn't know was that my daughter, Lily, was about to walk through that same door and give them exactly what they deserved to hear. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're tuning in from. Now, let me rewind and explain how a 67-year-old woman ended up face-to-face with the billionaire parents who abandoned her half a century ago. 3 months earlier, I'd finally received the DNA results I'd been waiting on for decades. After years of dead ends, false leads, and endless paperwork, a simple spit test cracked the case wide open. My biological parents were listed as Margaret Ashworth, age 92, and Edward Ashworth, age 94, the powerful real estate moguls behind a $2 billion empire. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire life working double shifts as a diner waitress in Toledo, Ohio, scraping by to raise my daughter, Lily, as a single mother. Meanwhile, my birth parents were living in a 30-room mansion in Napa Valley, probably spending more on wine each month than I made in a year. But being abandoned as a baby teaches you something. You grow a thick skin and a sharp tongue. Both were about to come in handy. I'd hired a private investigator, Marcus Wilson, who specialized in family reunions. "Mrs. Williams," he warned me over coffee, "I need to prepare you for the possibility they might not want contact." I'd laughed at that. After 5 decades of wondering, I thought I was ready for anything. Or so I believed. Marcus did his homework. The Ashworths had one acknowledged son, Charles, age 65, apparently as charming as a root canal. No mention anywhere of a daughter given up for adoption. "They've never publicly acknowledged you," Marcus said gently. This might be complicated. Complicated was the understatement of the century. It took Marcus 3 weeks to even get a response from their legal team. Billionaires don't just let strangers knock on their door, even ones holding DNA evidence. Finally, after piles of documentation and a background check that knew more about me than I did, Margaret Ashworth's assistant called. "Mrs. Ashworth can spare 30 minutes for this matter," she said, like I was some pest control appointment. But after 50 years, 30 minutes was 30 minutes more than I'd ever had. The 2-day drive from Toledo to Napa gave me plenty of time to imagine every possible scenario. Tears, apologies, maybe even a family dinner where I'd finally discover where my stubborn streak came from. Lily had wanted to come, but I insisted on going alone. "Mom, you don't have to face this by yourself," she'd said. "Sweetheart, I'd been alone my whole life. I could handle 2 old people with more money than sense. Besides, Lily was deep in pre-production meetings for her next film. At 38, she'd become one of Hollywood's most bankable leading ladies, yet she still called me every Sunday. Her success amazed me, from community theater in Toledo to A-list star. If anyone had beaten the odds, it was her. The Ashworth estate sat behind iron gates that probably cost more than my entire house. Security cameras tracked my rental car as I approached the intercom. After identifying myself and showing ID to the camera, the gate swung open. As I crunched up the gravel driveway, I had to admit, I was impressed despite myself. Manicured gardens stretched for acres, and the mansion looked like something out of Architectural Digest. An actual butler answered the door, accent and all. "Mrs. Williams, I presume?" he asked, eyeing me like I might pocket the silverware. "That's me," I said. "Evelyn Williams. But everyone calls me Dot. Thomas," that was his name, led me through hallways lined with paintings worth more than my annual salary. "Mrs. Ashworth is waiting in the conservatory," he said. Of course she was. Where else would a billionaire wait to meet the daughter she threw away? My hands were steadier than I expected. Maybe it was all those years dealing with rude customers at the diner. Or maybe I was simply too curious to be nervous. Either way, I was about to meet the woman who'd carried me for 9 months, and then decided I wasn't worth keeping. The conservatory was all glass and expensive plants. with a view of the valley that would have taken my breath away if I hadn't been focused on the woman sitting ramrod straight in a leather chair. Margaret Ashworth was 92, but looked like she could outlive me out of sheer spite. Her pale blue eyes were cold and calculating. She was impeccably dressed in designer everything, silver hair styled to perfection by what must have been an army of professionals. E, on the other hand, wore my best dress from JCPenney and the confidence that comes from earning every wrinkle on your face. "So," she said without preamble, "you're the child." Not my daughter. Not even Evelyn. Just the child, like I was a mistake she'd hoped would stay buried. "I'm Evelyn Williams," I replied, settling into the chair Thomas had placed across from her. "Though I'm sure you already knew that," she waved a dismissive hand. "Names can be changed. DNA, unfortunately, cannot." Her tone made it clear she'd have preferred if science had stayed out of her business. "I assume you want something," she continued. "They always do," I felt my temper simmer. They always do. How many long-lost children had knocked on her door? "I want answers," I said simply. "I've spent my entire life wondering who I am, where I come from, and why I was given away." Margaret's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked bored. "You were given away because you were inconvenient," she said matter-of-factly. "Edward and I were young, focused on building our fortune. A baby would have been a distraction." A distraction. 67 years of wondering, and that was the answer. "I see," I managed. "And now," she leaned back, studying me again. "You're here. I suppose you expect some sort of compensation for your troubles." The word compensation dripped with disdain. Then she delivered the line that would stick with me forever. "Don't expect money. We didn't want you then, and we don't want you now." The casual cruelty was breathtaking. She'd dismissed my entire existence like I was asking for spare change. But I'd learned long ago that the best response to cruelty is grace under pressure. "Well," I said, standing slowly, "that's certainly clear." I smoothed down my dress and glanced around the conservatory one more time. Beautiful plants, by the way. Must take a lot of care to keep something thriving in such a cold environment. If she caught the double meaning, she didn't show it. "Where do you think you're going?" Margaret's voice sliced through the room like a blade. I'd been walking toward the door, but apparently our little chat wasn't over. "I assumed we were finished," I replied, turning back. "You've made your position quite clear." She gestured for me to sit back down. "Edward hasn't met you yet. It would be rude to leave without seeing him." How thoughtful. After 50 years of silence, she was suddenly concerned about rudeness. But I was curious about the man who'd helped create me and then walked away. "Of course," I said, settling back into my chair. "Wouldn't want to be rude." The sarcasm was probably lost on her, but it made me feel better. Edward Ashworth entered the conservatory 10 minutes later, moving slowly with the help of an ornate walking stick. Where Margaret was cold steel, Edward was faded grandeur. He'd probably been handsome once, but now he just looked like an old man who'd lived too long and seen too much. "So you're Evelyn," he said, lowering himself into a chair beside Margaret. "You have the family eyes." "That's what the DNA test suggested," I replied. At least he'd used my name, a small improvement over the child. He studied me for a long moment. "What do you do for work?" he asked. Margaret shot him a look that could have frozen fire. "Apparently, we weren't supposed to get personal. I'm a waitress," I said firmly, holding my head high. "I've been working at Mel's Diner in Toledo for 23 years. I'd seen enough shame in my life to know I wasn't about to start feeling it now." Edward nodded slowly. "Honest work," he murmured. Margaret's expression, however, made it clear she disagreed. "Edward," she snapped. "We've already discussed this situation. That's what I was to them. Some inconvenience to be managed. Have you?" I asked, my voice steady. "Because I haven't. I haven't told you about my daughter, my life, or what I've built from nothing." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "We're not interested in your accomplishments." The sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension. Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking calmer than when he'd first greeted me. "Madam, there's a Ms. Williams here to see you. She says she's Mrs. Williams' daughter and that she's expected." My heart skipped. Expected? Lily and I had talked about this visit all week. She'd made me promise to call her the moment I left the estate. "Expected?" Margaret repeated sharply. Thomas nodded. "She has identification and does resemble Mrs. Williams. She also mentioned sending a text earlier today. That's when I remembered. Lily had texted me during my drive, saying she'd wrapped her meetings early and might join me if I needed support." Lily Williams swept into the conservatory like she owned it. Given her current box office status, she practically did. My daughter had inherited my height, but added Hollywood glamour. Even in jeans and a simple sweater, she commanded attention, making Margaret Ashworth look like a relic from another era. "Sorry I'm late?" "Mom," Lily said, kissing my cheek before turning to my biological parents. The flight from Vancouver was delayed, and the traffic from the airport was brutal. Margaret and Edward stared at her with a flicker of recognition, the kind that comes from seeing someone on magazine covers and movie screens. "You're—" Margaret began, genuinely surprised for the first time since I'd arrived. "Lily Williams," my daughter said with the smile that had launched a dozen romantic comedies. "Evelyn's daughter. Your granddaughter, I suppose." I watched Edward's face cycle through emotions before settling on something that might have been pride. Typical. They couldn't be bothered with a diner waitress, but a movie star granddaughter suddenly mattered. "I thought you were in meetings," I said, still processing her arrival. "Wrapped early yesterday," she replied, sliding into the chair beside me. "I flew down this morning. I wasn't going to let you face this alone, especially after you called sounding so nervous." She was right. I had called her, rambling about my anxiety over this meeting. Lily glanced around the conservatory with the polite curiosity she'd perfected on talk shows. "Beautiful home. Must be worth what, $50 million? $60, Margaret recovered quickly. "We weren't expecting additional guests," she said stiffly. Lily's smile didn't falter. "Well, that seems to be a pattern with you two, doesn't it? Not expecting people." The temperature in the room dropped. "Lily," I began, but she held up a hand. "It's okay, Mom. I've been looking forward to this." She turned to Margaret and Edward. "You know, I've heard so much about you. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone in my life. Mom wondered if her birth parents ever thought about her. If you ever regretted your choice." Edward shifted uncomfortably. Margaret stayed stone-faced. "And now," Lily continued, "I have my answer. You didn't think about her. You don't regret anything. In fact, you're treating her like she's here to steal the silver instead of finally meet the people who created her." The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. Then Margaret spoke. "We owe her nothing," she said to Lily, as if I weren't sitting right there. "She's lived her life. We've lived ours." Lily leaned back in her chair, her expression one I knew well, the same one I got before telling off a rude customer. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "You don't owe her anything. But I'm curious about something." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling. "Mom mentioned you've been very generous with charities. I looked into it during my flight." Margaret and Edward exchanged wary glances. "What are you talking about?" Margaret asked. Lily held up her phone. "According to public tax records, you'd be amazed what you can find when you know where to look. You've donated millions to children's charities over the decades." She paused. "The most interesting was the $3 million you gave to St. Catherine's Home for Children in 1959, just 2 years after my mother was born." The silence was deafening. St. Catherine's. That was where I'd grown up. Where the nuns had told me my parents were young and unmarried, unable to care for a child. Where I'd spent my childhood wondering if love would ever find me. $3 million in 1959, Lily repeated. "That's about $30 million in today's money. That's a lot to give to an orphanage." Margaret finally spoke, her composure cracking like ice in spring. "That donation was for tax purposes, was it?" Lily asked, her tone innocent. Because the records show a very specific stipulation. The money was to be used exclusively for children placed due to difficult family circumstances. I felt like I'd been punched. They'd given millions to help children like me while pretending I didn't exist. You donated money to help abandoned children while refusing to acknowledge your own, I said quietly. The hypocrisy is staggering. There's more, Lily added, consulting her phone again. $2 million to Children's Hospital in 1975. $4 million to the Foster Care Foundation in 1983. Another $6 million to various adoption agencies over the years. She looked up. $28 million in total to help children who were given away, but not one penny to the child you actually gave away. Edward stared at his hands, looking every one of his 94 years. We were trying to do good, he said weakly. We were young when Evelyn was born. You thought you could buy your way out of guilt, Lily finished. Newsflash, it didn't work. That's when we heard a car door slam outside, followed by raised voices. Thomas appeared in the doorway, visibly distressed. Sir, Madam, Master Charles is here. He seems agitated. Charles Ashworth burst into the conservatory like a storm. His face was red with exertion and panic. He was a soft-looking man in his 60s, with the kind of paunch that came from too many business lunches. His expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat soaking through it. Mother, father, what on earth are you doing? He gasped, stopping short when he saw Lily and me. You actually let them in? Do you have any idea what this could cost us? Margaret straightened. Charles, meet your half-sister Evelyn and your niece Lily. Charles's eyes widened as he recognized my daughter. But panic quickly replaced any starstruck moment. This is a disaster, he muttered, pacing the conservatory. I got a call from our head of security 20 minutes ago. Someone's been making inquiries about our family trust. Professional inquiries. He turned to Lily. I assume that was you? Lily smiled sweetly. Actually, that was my business manager, Patricia Chen. She's very thorough about protecting my interests, and apparently my family's too. She held up her phone. Funny thing about being a successful actress, you get access to some very expensive legal minds. When I heard Mom was coming here, I asked Patricia to do some research. What kind of research? Margaret asked, her voice tight. Lily consulted her phone. Turns out Patricia used to work for Goldman Sachs before she became a talent manager. She knows how to read financial documents, and she has friends who specialize in family trust law. Charles had gone pale. What exactly did she find? Lily's expression grew serious. She found that your grandfather was apparently much smarter than you realized. When he set up the original family trust in 1952, he included what's called a bloodline protection clause. Basically, any biological heir with legitimate DNA evidence is entitled to an equal share of the family assets. The room tilted. How much are we talking about? I asked quietly. Lily looked at her phone again. According to Patricia's research, the family trust is worth approximately $1.8 billion. Charles gets a third as the acknowledged son, and any other biological children get equal shares of the remaining assets. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. Congratulations, Mom. You're entitled to about $600 million. Margaret let out a strangled gasp. That's impossible. We would have changed that clause years ago if we'd known about it. Lily shook her head. You can't. That's the genius of it. Your grandfather added a provision that the bloodline clause could only be removed with unanimous consent from all living heirs. Since you never even acknowledged Evelyn, you never asked for her consent. Charles's hands were locked around the back of a chair, his knuckles bone white. This will destroy everything, he whispered. The board, the shareholders, the partnerships. Everything depends on stable family control. Lily tilted her head, her voice laced with sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. That does sound like a problem for you. Stop, Charles snapped, his voice cracking into near hysteria. You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't just about money. It's about 40 years of relationships, board seats, agreements. If people find out there's been a hidden heir for 67 years, it'll throw every deal we've ever made into chaos. Lily rose, walking slowly around the conservatory like an attorney giving her closing argument. You know what, Charles? I'm starting to see the family dynamic here. She gestured toward Margaret and Edward. Your parents abandoned their daughter because she didn't fit their business plans. And now you're having a meltdown because acknowledging her threatens yours. You don't understand the complexity, Charles started. Oh, I understand perfectly, Lily cut in. I work in an industry where image is everything, where one scandal can erase a career overnight. The difference is, I don't throw family under the bus to protect my bottom line. She drew another folder from her purse. Patricia also dug up something interesting about your recent business activities. Quietly shifting assets, moving properties offshore, restructuring debts. Lily's eyes met Charles's. Almost like you knew this day might come. Edward's walking stick clattered to the marble floor. How could you possibly know about those transactions? He asked, his voice trembling. Lily's smile was razor-sharp. Patricia has friends everywhere, including at the SEC. Move that much money, people notice. The real question is why you were preparing for this if you never thought it would happen. Margaret's polished facade cracked. She looked older, smaller, and for the first time, frightened. We've always known the clause existed, she admitted quietly. Our lawyers searched for a loophole for decades, and never found one, Lily finished. Because your grandfather was smarter than all of you combined. He wanted the family fortune to stay with family, not just whoever was convenient at the time. She turned to me. Mom, you're not just entitled to this money. You're entitled to a board seat, voting rights, and full access to the family business records. Charles let out a sound like a wounded animal. She can't just walk in here and take over everything we've built. Everything you built? Lily's tone hardened. From where I'm standing, you inherited an empire and have been coasting on your grandfather's vision ever since. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. I read it aloud, my stomach sinking. Apparently, someone at the Ashworth legal firm has been asking questions about me. They know about my visit. Charles's face flushed. I called our attorneys the moment security reported the inquiries. We have rights to, you know. We can protect ourselves. Lily laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Protect yourselves. From what? From having to acknowledge the daughter you threw away. From financial extortion, Charles shot back. From people who think they can waltz in and demand money from families who've worked for generations to build something meaningful. His venom stunned me. My half-brother saw me as nothing but a threat to his bank account. I rose slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years. Charles, I didn't even know about any inheritance until 10 minutes ago. I came here for answers, not money. I turned from Margaret to Edward to Charles. I wanted to know why. I wanted to understand how 3 people could create a life and then just forget it existed. Margaret opened her mouth, but I raised my hand. For 67 years, I've wondered if you ever thought of me. If you ever regretted your choice. If you ever wondered who I became. I walked to the window overlooking their flawless gardens. I wanted to know if I had your eyes, your smile, your stubbornness. I wanted family. We were 25 and 27, Margaret said softly. Edward's family business was collapsing. My father threatened to disown me if I didn't marry someone who could save our finances. We thought a baby would ruin everything. So you built an empire instead, I said, turning to face them. Congratulations. Was it worth it? Edward retrieved his walking stick with shaking hands. We told ourselves you'd be better off. That a young couple could give you what we couldn't. A stable home, love, attention. Did you ever check? I asked. Their silence was answer enough. Because if you had, I continued, you'd know I was placed with the Hendersons. Frank worked in a factory. Mary cleaned houses. They had more love than money, but they gave me everything they had. The pain in my chest was familiar now. They died when I was 19. A car accident on their way to my college graduation. After that, it was just me. No family, no safety net. No trust fund to fall back on. I gestured around the conservatory. So yes, I built my life from nothing. And yes, I made mistakes, but I never abandoned a child. Margaret's tears carved tracks through her flawless makeup. We can't undo what we did, she whispered. We can't go back. No, I agreed. You can't. But you can choose what happens next. Lily stepped beside me, her hand slipping into mine. My daughter, my greatest triumph, proof that love can overcome circumstance. I've made my choice, I said to Margaret, Edward, and Charles. I don't want your money. I want nothing from you except one thing. Charles's head snapped up. I want you to establish a foundation in my adoptive parents' names, Frank and Mary Henderson. Use my share of the inheritance to help children in foster care find permanent, loving homes. Silence. You're giving up $600 million? Charles asked, stunned. I'm giving it to people who understand what family really means, I replied. Unlike the three of you. Charles stared at me like I'd lost my mind. You can't be serious. You're walking away from $600 million. I nodded calmly. I've lived 67 years without your money. I think I'll manage just fine. But you can't just give it away either, he sputtered. The foundation idea would need board approval, legal restructuring, tax implications. It could take years. Lily raised her phone. Actually, Patricia says Evelyn has the right to assign her inheritance to any charitable organization she chooses. It's called a charitable trust assignment. It can be executed immediately. She smiled at Charles. Your grandfather really was thorough. There's another issue, Margaret said quietly. If Evelyn creates this foundation, it becomes public record. The media will investigate. The story will come out anyway. Your mother's identity, her connection to us. Everything we've tried to keep private. Lily's eyes turned thoughtful. You're right. This will be a huge story. Movie star's mother discovers billionaire birth parents. A reunion after 67 years. The daughter who was given away returns to give back. She paused. Of course, how the story is told depends on how cooperative everyone is. Charles's face flushed crimson. Are you threatening us? Lily shook her head. I'm offering you a choice. We can do this quietly with dignity, focusing on the positive side of Evelyn's decision to help children in need. Or we can do it the other way, where I start giving interviews about how my mother was treated when she tried to reconnect with her birth family. The power dynamic shifted. For the first time since I'd arrived, the Ashworths were at a disadvantage. What do you want? Margaret asked softly. I want my mother treated with respect, Lily said simply. Acknowledged, recognized, and I want the foundation established exactly as she's requested, with full family support. Edward finally spoke. What about Charles? His position, his inheritance? Lily looked at my half-brother with something like pity. Charles keeps his third of the inheritance, his board seat, his relationships. All we're asking is that he stop treating my mother like she's here to steal something that was never his to begin with. And if we refuse? Charles asked. Lily's smile returned, but it wasn't warm. Then Patricia has a very different conversation with her friends at the financial press. And I have a very different conversation with my publicist. Your choice. The silence stretched on. Finally, Margaret asked, What would you need from us? A public statement, Lily said without hesitation. Acknowledging Evelyn as your daughter and explaining the circumstances of her adoption in a way that shows respect for everyone involved. She held up her phone. Patricia already drafted something. The Ashworth family is pleased to announce the reunion with Margaret and Edward's daughter, Evelyn Williams, who was placed for adoption in 1958. Because of her young parents' circumstances, Evelyn's life took a different path. She kept reading. We are deeply proud of the extraordinary life Evelyn has built and honored to support her decision to establish the Whitmore Foundation for Foster Care, named after the loving adoptive parents who raised her. Margaret and Edward exchanged a long, silent look. After 67 years of marriage, they could still communicate without a single word. It sounds fair, Margaret said at last. Charles opened his mouth to object, but Edward lifted his hand to stop him. Evelyn, Edward said, looking directly at me for the first time since this conversation began, not a day has passed in 67 years that I haven't thought about you. Wondered what kind of woman you became. If you were happy, if you found love. His voice trembled. I know it doesn't excuse what we did, but you were never forgotten. Tears stung my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. Then why didn't you ever try to find me? He was silent for a long moment. Because we were cowards. Because we convinced ourselves you were better off without us. Because admitting we were wrong would have meant facing the truth of what we'd given up. Margaret rose slowly, her composure finally breaking. Evelyn, I know you may never forgive us. We don't deserve it. But giving you away was the greatest mistake of my life. Not for money, not for appearances, but because I lost the chance to know an extraordinary woman. Her hands shook as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, yellowed photograph. This is the only picture I have of you, taken at the hospital before. She couldn't finish the sentence. The photo showed a tiny baby with dark hair and serious eyes. Me, 67 years ago? I've carried this with me every day since 1958, Margaret whispered. I know it doesn't undo anything, but I want you to have it. She held the photograph out with trembling hands. I looked at the picture, then at the 3 people who shared my DNA but had never shared my life. I'll take it, I said finally. Not because it changes anything, but because every child deserves to know where they came from. Lily stepped to my side. There's one more thing, she said firmly to Margaret, Edward, and Charles. The foundation will be headquartered in Toledo, Ohio. Evelyn will stay on the board, but she will continue living her life on her own terms. No family obligations, no expectations, no strings attached. I smiled at my daughter, understanding what she was doing, protecting me. She was making sure I could accept their support for the foundation without accepting them back into my life. And if any of you want a relationship with me, I added, you'll have to earn it from scratch. Like any real family, it has to be built on respect, trust, and genuine care. Margaret nodded through her tears. We understand. Charles still looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, but he stayed silent. The legal paperwork would take weeks to finalize, but the conversation that mattered was over. As Lily and I walked toward the conservatory doors, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had found my birth family, uncovered the truth of my past, and discovered that sometimes the family you choose matters more than the one you're born into. You know the best part? I said to Lily as we reached our rental car. She smiled at me, my brilliant, successful daughter who still called me every Sunday. What's that, Mom? I already had everything I needed. I just didn't realize it until now. We drove away from the Brookfield Manor, leaving behind a lifetime of questions and carrying with us the only answer that really mattered. Love isn't about blood, money, or even time. It's about choosing to show up for each other every single day. And I had been blessed with someone who had shown up for me since the day she was born. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're comfortable, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters,